Welcome to my channel, Midsummer Myths, where you find stories like no other, packed with twists, drama, and unbelievable moments you won't forget. Today's story is one that reaches deep into the heart of war, youth, and the scars left behind a Vietnam veteran's raw, unforgettable account of being sent to fight when he was only 18 years old. Imagine being just a kid, barely out of high school, then suddenly thrown into the most brutal, unforgiving war in modern history. Most would call it a rite of passage or service to country, but for him it was something much darker. He calls it child abuse. That's the hook right there. How does a war that shaped history also destroy the innocence of an 18-year-old boy? His story starts in the sweltering jungles of Vietnam, where the lines between survival and death blur every day. At 18, many are dreaming about college, summer jobs, or young love, not firefights, loss, and heartbreak. But he had no choice. Drafted, trained, and shipped overseas before he even understood the gravity of it all. You might ask, how did he survive? What did he see? And how did this experience haunt him years later? Stay with me, because what he reveals is as shocking as it is heartbreaking. From the moment he landed in Vietnam, it was chaos. The noise of helicopters, the smell of gunpowder, and the fear in every soldier's eyes were constant companions. Yet the military treated them like machines, kids in uniform, expected to carry out impossible missions. The emotional weight was crushing, and the dangers relentless. But beyond the battlefield horrors, the true abuse was in how the system discarded them. Young men sent to fight without the protection or guidance they desperately needed. This veteran says it felt like being a pawn, expendable and forgotten. Today, as he recounts his story, you'll hear the emotional scars that never healed, the moments of terror, loss, and brotherhood, the nights when sleep was impossible and the guilt unbearable. Before we dive into the depths of this powerful tale, I want to remind you to stay until the end. There's a twist that you won't see coming, a moment of justice and hope that's as surprising as the story itself, so buckle up. This is not just another war story, it's a human story about youth stolen, courage tested, and the fight to reclaim a life shattered by war. If you think war is just about guns and glory, wait until you hear what this veteran says about the real price paid by boys like him. Asterisk, they say, war changes a man, but for me, it changed a boy before he ever had the chance to become a man. Landing in Vietnam felt like stepping into a nightmare painted with chaos and fear. The humid jungle clung to every inch of my uniform, my skin, my very soul. At 18, I was supposed to be learning to live my life, but instead I was fighting for it every single day. The war's escalation was brutal and relentless. I was thrust into firefights, ambushes, and patrols with no time to process what was happening. My training back home was nothing compared to the terror of gunfire exploding around me. I watched friends fall beside me, some never to rise again. That boy, I was barely knew how to handle such loss. Every mission seemed like a death sentence, yet we moved forward because the orders came from above. We were told we were defending freedom, but some days it felt more like we were forgotten, abandoned on the front lines. My commanding officers expected bravery and discipline, but they rarely offered comfort or understanding. The emotional toll was invisible to them. We were soldiers on the outside, but scared boys inside. We coped in any way we could, some through silence, some through anger, others through sheer numbness. The jungle became a prison of anxiety. The buzzing of insects and distant gunfire was constant background noise. The threat of an ambush could come at any second. Sleep was a luxury and nightmares the norm. I began to lose track of time, losing pieces of myself with every passing day. One of the hardest parts wasn't just the physical danger, was the weight of responsibility thrust onto shoulders that should have been carefree. I was tasked with decisions that no teenager should ever have to make: who to trust, when to shoot, how to survive. Each choice carried the risk of life or death, but the worst pain came from the invisible wounds. I saw comrades suffer in silence from what they called the shakes, or worse, the horrors of what we now call PTSD. Back then, there was no support, no understanding. We were told to be tough, to keep going. I often wonder how I made it through those months. The strength to survive wasn't just mine. It came from the bonds forged with my brothers in arms. We were all just kids, but together we found a way to keep going, to watch each other's backs in a world that wanted to break us. This section could go on forever, but the next chapter of my story reveals the real injustice: how the government and society treated us when we came home, as if the scars we bore were invisible. They sent us to fight as children, but when we returned, they treated us like ghosts, forgotten and ignored. Returning home was supposed to mean relief and safety. What I found instead was betrayal and silence. After the war, I stepped back onto American soil with hope and dread tangled inside me. The war had taken everything from me, yet I expected a hero's welcome, some recognition and support to rebuild my life. What I got was the exact opposite. I was an 18-year-old boy who had witnessed horrors no one should ever see. My body carried the bruises and wounds of battle, but my mind bore deeper injuries. The world around me seemed indifferent, even hostile. The government barely acknowledged the trauma many of us carried. Veterans like me were shuffled through endless paperwork, passed from one agency to another, fighting for medical care and benefits. The system was cold and bureaucratic, designed to discourage us from asking too many questions. Society's perception didn't help either. Many saw us as broken, dangerous, or damaged. Some families and communities rejected returning soldiers, either out of fear or misunderstanding. This lack of support pushed many of us into isolation. What felt like abandonment was a cruel extension of the war itself. The same government that sent us as children into battle now discarded us without a second thought. The term child abuse began to echo in my mind, not just for what happened in Vietnam, but for what happened when we came home. I struggled to find work, connect with family, and rebuild a life that made sense. The nightmares didn't stop. Flashbacks came unbidden, shaking me awake in the dead of night. I couldn't explain these feelings to anyone who hadn't been there. Friends I'd made overseas became my refuge. We shared stories, anger, and pain. We held each other up because no one else would. Some of us found solace in veterans groups or therapy, but many suffered alone. The scars of war reached beyond the battlefield. They invaded every part of life. Relationships strained, jobs lost, dreams deferred. I often felt invisible, a casualty not only of combat, but of neglect. But through it all, I refused to let this be the end of my story. I found strength in speaking out, in telling my truth. This is where the real fight began. Not against an enemy in a distant land, but against the injustice and silence back home. If you think the war ended when the guns fell silent, think again. This battle lasted a lifetime. Asterisk, sometimes the hardest battles are fought far from the battlefield, in courtrooms, in memories, and in hearts. Years after the war, I made a decision that shocked many. I decided to speak openly about what it meant to be an 18-year-old thrown into Vietnam. I called it what it was: child abuse. The word stirred controversy, but it was my truth. I joined forces with fellow veterans who shared the same pain and anger. Together, we campaigned for recognition, better mental health care, and changes to military recruitment practices. We weren't just fighting for ourselves, but for every young person who might one day be sent into harm's way. The struggle was long and exhausting. Government officials resisted admitting any fault. The narrative was always about honor and patriotism, but we wanted to highlight the human cost behind the medals. Slowly, changes began. Awareness grew about PTSD, about the psychological wounds, that invisible to the naked eye. Support programs expanded, and laws were passed to protect younger recruits from being sent into dangerous zones too soon. On a personal level, speaking out gave me a sense of purpose. I transformed my pain into advocacy, sharing my story in schools, veterans groups, and documentaries. Each time I told it, I hoped to reach just one person who might understand or prevent others from suffering as I did. But revenge in this story isn't about anger or hatred. It's about justice, healing, and reclaiming dignity. The real victory was standing up to the system that treated me like a child soldier, disposable in war. This fight wasn't easy. There were days I wanted to give up, overwhelmed by memories and setbacks. But every small win, every new law, every grateful listener fueled my resolve. I found a new mission: to protect the youth of tomorrow, and to remind the world that behind every veteran is a story worth hearing. They tried to bury our stories, but we rose, and now we make sure no child soldier's pain goes unheard. Asterisk. This is not just a story about war. It's about survival, justice, and reclaiming a stolen youth. Today, as I look back on my journey from that scared 18-year-old boy to a man who found his voice, I feel a mix of pride and sorrow. The war took so much, but it also taught me the strength of resilience. I've learned that calling it child abuse wasn't about blame, it was about truth. The truth that young lives were risked without full understanding or protection, and that we must never repeat those mistakes. My hope now is that stories like mine open eyes, hearts, and minds. That society honors veterans not just with ceremonies, but with real support, empathy, and action. If there's one thing I want you to remember from this story, it's this: behind every uniform is a human being, often young, often scared, always deserving of respect. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the forgotten chapters of war. I hope it moved you, made you think, and inspired you to learn more. How did you like this story? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more incredible stories from Midsummer Myths.